So let's move on to the next talk by Greg Reichberg and Henrik Syse. So you're not only sitting together, but you're going to give the talk together.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for letting me borrow your name. It'll just last for this session. No, I won't, not without your permission. In Norway today, everyone would say congratulations and happy birthday because this is our Constitution Day. So that's a big thing in Norway, and our teenagers are wondering, how can we be here in the Vatican and in Rome? Don't they know it's May 17th? And they do, but that doesn't mean that much. But it's a pleasure to be with all of you. These are very complex questions, as we learn. I heard a funny story about a man who had done a jigsaw puzzle. And it had taken a long time, so he tells his wife, "I'm finally finished." And she says, "Well, that took you 3 months." And he replies, "Well, that's nothing. On the box, it says 2 to 3 years." So the question of how complex things are different depending on where you look at it from. But I think we can all agree that this will take more than 2 to 3 years. We have a presentation based on a paper that you can read. It's based on a project that my very good colleague Greg and I have been developing together with some colleagues at PRIO and together with some US colleagues. In a way, it tries to wed the world of cutting-edge technology with the classical and medieval idea of virtue. What role does what we call in moral philosophy virtue ethics play as we confront the questions of artificial intelligence in the military? So that's the basic question we are trying to get at.
For those who don't know, that's Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, I took for granted that everyone would see it as Thomas Aquinas. And Greg, of course, has written a wonderful book recently out on Cambridge University Press on Thomas Aquinas and the ethics of war. There. That up in the corner was some other future saint from when we admit them into the church. There are some introductory remarks that we make, and I'll go through them very quickly before leaving the word to Greg for some of the meat of our presentation. We discuss first the relationship between what we often call automatic and autonomous. And I'd like to thank Bruce a lot for his very useful paper. A lot of the things we say are nicely laid out in more detail in your excellent work. It's important to remember that when we talk about what we perceive as autonomous, this machine is making the decision for itself. That is often in the eye of the beholder. Because if we don't understand what a machine is doing, it seems to us that it's thinking for itself. When my cell phone goes off and does something that I don't know anything about, it seems to me that it is thinking for itself. But of course, it's still pre-programmed, and it's not anywhere near what we would call fully autonomous. And I therefore we think that the reminder that we're dealing with rather narrow artificial intelligence for now, and that full autonomy in the sense of the sort of autonomy that a human being would be experiencing internally is not what we're faced with. And also to remind ourselves that autonomous operation is not the same as free choice in the sense that we think of it in human terms. Now, as already pointed out, this is a complex discussion. It says discussions here, of which our paper presents 3 aspects. We first ask some of the questions about how we actually program AI weaponry when it comes to morality and legal questions. We raise the question about how you instill a sort of functional morality in these sorts of systems. And we ask the question about whether one should be working top-down or bottom-up. Top-down in the sense you start with a moral theory and then you implement it. Or in the terms of bottom-up, where you are actually taking as your point of departure the sort of context that you enter and build from there, which is closer to the model of machine learning. Secondly, we enter the debate that Bruce definitely has much to say about, namely the human-in-the-loop debate. And we borrow a threefold distinction from Bill Shar, I guess his name, who's written excellently on this, on between in the killing loop, on the loop, and outside of the loop. Where in the loop would be where the kill decision cannot be carried out without human approval. Whereas on the killing loop is what we would talk about where a system can sense, decide, and act on its own, but it remains under the supervision of a human being who can veto the passage from decision to action. And then finally, you have the fully autonomous machine killing, whereby a human being is needed only to activate the machine. And once it's been activated, it will carry out its assigned task without communication back to the human user. And then the third and final part of our paper, which I'll talk about briefly at the end, is about the ethical framework for AI-human interaction, and that's where we discuss virtue ethics. Now, as a bridge over to what Greg will talk about, I think it's true, and I think we sense it here as well, that there is a divide between optimists and pessimists. And obviously there is a gliding scale there, and you can be optimists in some ways and pessimists in others. What we hope to do also with our paper is to listen carefully to the concerns of both parties, starting with the question of what is actually the military utility of these sorts of systems, what we often call lethal autonomous weapons systems. Why would we want to develop them in the first place? Which leads me to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Henrik. I'll just add on the word autonomous, that we use it in the paper to designate a situation where the selection of the means for reaching a preset goal is left to the system itself, all right? Which is what happens with machine learning. So, and then that, we contrast to what's termed free choice of the will, where I dominate the reasons for my action, right? No one reason for action is so compelling that I'm necessitated by it, all right? So this is a different sense of autonomy. Now, when we come to what's driving the development of autonomous weapons, we see really three main factors. First of all, if you contrast an autonomous robot to a non-autonomous robot. I mean, non-autonomous robots have been used in military settings for a very long time, right? And, like diffusing bombs, for instance. They are extremely costly to operate because one non-autonomous robot could take 10 people sitting in a control room or more, right? So, and then if you come into situations of swarm warfare, I mean, the costs involved are enormous. Now, of course, there are advantages to having a non-autonomous robot because the human control is much tighter. But again, you come up against a sort of an economic factor. So, okay, autonomous weapon systems are extremely useful in situations where communication links can be compromised or are even inexistent. All right, communication links don't work well deep undersea, for example. And another reason militating for their use. And of course, Bruce has elaborated at length on superior reaction time. Now, we develop, when it comes to the ethical debates concerning whether or not lethal autonomous weapon systems should or should not be used, okay, and the abbreviation is LAWS. There are really, we describe it as two opposing camps. First of all, yeah, thanks. First of all, they're the optimists. People who think on ethical grounds that using lethal autonomous weapons would represent a significant advance. And here are some of the reasons that the optimists give. We're calling them optimists, okay? They don't call themselves that. All right, beyond the obvious point that robots fighting each other would spare human combatants from having to do the same, thus resulting in less loss of a life, the optimists also claim that robots, even when fighting human beings, would show greater battlefield probity, would exercise better judgment on the battlefield, because they would not be misled by emotion. Robotic lethal targeting judgments would not be deflected by rage, by hatred, and passion, as human combatants often are. I mean, there have been lots of studies of what happens when atrocities occur. Some atrocities occur on the basis of some sort of rational deliberation in advance. So, for instance, when rape is used as a weapon in war, but other times atrocities occur when human emotions, especially in group settings, emotions such as rage and so forth, just get out of control. And
even before that, we point out, of course, that with higher precision, this is, B.J. Strauss and others. You have fewer fatalities and less suffering.
Sure. So, moreover, robotic fighters would have an additional benefit insofar as they could be counted on to assume risk upon themselves to protect civilians, something that human combatants often shy away from. All right? So, for instance, to protect civilians in targeting decisions, low-flying aircraft are superior to high-flying aircraft. But of course, low-flying aircraft put pilots in greater danger. So there's always often a payoff between force protection on the one hand and civilian protection on the other. So presumably, robots would not be guided by that sort of calculation. Optimists are also quick to acknowledge the economic as well as tactical advantages of autonomous lethal systems. For instance, whereas remotely controlled and supervised battlefield robots require much human capital for their operation, these high costs would be bypassed through the autonomously functioning robots, something I've already mentioned. There are tactical benefits also, insofar as autonomous robots eliminate the need for electromagnetic communication links and so forth, which I've already mentioned. Okay, now, pessimists, by contrast, have offered a set of opposing arguments. First of all, the anticipation of decreased battlefield human casualty rates, all right, through the introduction of robots, would lower the perceived risks of waging war. All right, so war could become more likely. At least for the deploying side. So that while individual wars might become less bloody, the number of wars could grow proportionately. And this would especially be the case on the part of militaries that place a very high value on force protection. Pessimists also are quick to point out that it is an illusion to think that robotic warfare would render wars entirely bloodless. Ultimately, the fruit of defeat on the battlefield will be the vulnerability of one civilian population to lethal robotic attack, which, given the new technologies developed, like swarmed drone attacks, could lead to massive deaths on a par with nuclear detonations. I mean, if miniaturized drones become, inexpensive, you could produce massive amounts of them. And, some of the optimists operate with a very old version of what warfare is about. They have this idea that war is a kind of convention where there's an agreement on both sides that we will, the side that prevails on the battlefield with its military force, there's an agreement that side wins the contest. We agree by convention that the fighting is over and the political will of the other prevails. But that's an outdated conception of war. No one's fighting war that way now. Now the civilian populations are vulnerable from more or less the outset. And that's been a long trend in warfare. I mean, it started with the development of air power. And all of a sudden, before, in order to get to the civilian population, you had to defeat the adversary's military first, right? But that really is no longer the case. So that the battlefield has become compressed. It's become the civilians have become much more accessible than they ever were. So even if you had this wonderful scenario where there's only robots fighting each other, once one of the robotic sides prevails, what then? Then you get civilians as the target. Okay. Pessimists point out that there's an ever-present risk of escalation. That's one of the challenges when decision-making is made under conditions of speed, and when decision-making is becomes automatic. It's much harder to stop sort of tit-for-tat escalations. Finally, it's pointed out that a new arms race will emerge, and Bruce has told us that it already has emerged, right? With the most unscrupulous actors prevailing over those who show restraint. For instance, AI engineers at leading U.S. technology firms are refusing to engage in military design projects with lethal applications. It is said that at Chinese defense contracting firms, where the development of AI systems is a priority, engineers have not expressed the same reservations. How are we doing time-wise? I think I've said.
Skip the last three ones. It's too much pessimism now.
We'll move on to the next.
Yeah, well, yeah. In the danger of listing too many pessimistic points, I'll skip to the meat of our paper, where we argue for the usefulness of virtue ethics in all of this. We propose that a virtue ethics perspective is especially useful when investigating the ethical implications of human participation in what is now often known in military jargon as the force mix, the mix of human and AI operators. It could be argued that an increased reliance on automated weapons and AI makes virtue ethics less central to the military enterprise, that this has been a traditional way of talking about the education of soldiers and officers, what kind of person you are, what kind of virtues should be instilled in you, but that is different when it comes to artificial intelligence, that we'd rather need a more deontic, rules-based focus, since machines per se cannot have virtues, while they can indeed be programmed to follow rules. We would argue to the contrary, that the question of virtue becomes even more pressing in the face of AI, since the very role and competence of the human soldier is what is being challenged and placed under great pressure. How do we ensure that soldiers and officers maintain those virtues that make them fit for military service and command, instead of delegating them to AI systems, and in the process maybe ignoring or losing them? We start with a point of view from Shannon Valor on what actually virtues are. What are the appropriate dispositions for the proper exercise of one's professional role? And if the professional role of the soldier and officer in our time and age is exactly to interact with and use artificial intelligence, how does that question change? Or rather, how does the answer to that question change? So we try to conclude our paper by formulating some of the core questions we believe virtue ethics helps us ask, and the developments that should be instilled in or thought about in not least military training. So part of our audience will also be those who create curricula at military academies. And they talk a lot about virtues. What are the relevant questions when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence and robots? Where we fear that the two parts of the military curricula are in different places. So you have a tech-centered education about the use of artificial intelligence, and you have a separate one about virtue. Firstly, how can we ensure that the basic military virtues are not weakened by artificial intelligence? This is often in the debate on AI called the question of de-skilling. In an ideal world, artificial intelligence is used in a way that makes us better at doing what humans are good at. And the danger is that you get the opposite, that we delegate things that human beings are arguably good at, maybe are the only ones who can do properly for the foreseeable future, such as prudent reflection on what are the right aims and goals, and that we delegate them to machines, or that we become less good at doing them. We have another one, which is an interesting one in a military context, and it certainly touches on questions Margaret and others have raised earlier. We put it this way in the paper: the Stoic ideal of peace of mind, balance, and moderation is often touted as a military ideal, based exactly on a virtue ethical tradition. But we must also ask to what extent this ideal denies the importance of emotions for proper moral understanding. I just got the emotion of being late. How does artificial intelligence play into this debate about the role of emotions such as fear, anger, distrust, doubt, and remorse? All feelings with significant relevance for decision-making in war. I'll take the last two questions very quickly. Both have been raised in various contexts earlier here. Thirdly, in the Socratic tradition, dialogue is considered a crucial prerequisite for the development of virtues and proper decision-making. But what kind of a dialogue takes place in the human-AI encounter? Is an AI-based system with significant linguistic and machine learning capabilities a real dialogue partner? What kind of a dialogue partner is it? What kind of conversation are we having? And finally, and most generally, which are the virtues most relevant to humans in the human-AI force mix? To what extent do those virtues, such as moderation and courage, which we assume will be among them, two of the cardinal virtues, to what extent do they change their character as a result of the use of AI-based systems? Thank you.